Education has been the topic of conversation in our state recently, with many House and Senate bills out that could affect how education is shaped in our state. In these situations, the two best things we can do are to stay informed and involved on these bills. In an effort to do that, today we have Little River Junior Senior High School Principal Audrey Johnson, Wyndham Elementary Principal John Payton, and Superintendent of our district, Betty Summers. Thank you everybody for joining us. The first issue or bill that we'll talk about is House Bill 2486. And this bill pertains to bond issues. And in the past, it's been if a bond issue was passed locally, it could move forward. This changes that. So exactly how does this House Bill 2486 affect us locally when it comes to bond issues?
You know, actually, the legislature spent the first couple days this week in their turnaround process getting things taken care of, and then they're taking a break. And they pushed this up a little bit quicker than usual. It's about a week sooner. But in that process, they have folded that House bill. It's gone to a different committee into a Senate bill 368, which basically addresses the same thing. That if a district wants to pass a bond question, and if they are in a certain assessed value area and considered wealthy in the state of Kansas, they don't qualify for any support from the state. And so this would not impact them. But if they funded bonds the way they have in the past, what happens now is, but you can pass a bond question if you're going to pay for it all, but you would have to take it to a select committee that has legislative representation, somebody from the State Board of Ed, but not local board members, and they would have to approve what part of that bond would qualify for reimbursement. So there are just some really tricky things that seem to not be a way to recognize local control. In the past, if a district felt like they needed to do some renovations to the building, they took a question and there was a formula, but districts would get some support from the state. Well, when money is tight, you figure out what you can do to live within your budget, and what the state has decided is that they need more control over those decisions of who gets state money to help with those bond questions. The other thing is they're only looking at instructional areas. And in a recent conversation with Superintendent Bill Day in Lyons, the question was, what part of that new middle school did you build that was instructional? Well, by the time you take out the bathrooms and the hallways and the cafeterias, only about 50% of it would qualify through this process if it was approved by the committee. So it really, in trying to come up with ways to fund schools in Kansas, there are some things that just don't make sense, because we are proud of the Kansas heritage of local boards of education making decisions about their district and not having to jump through multiple hoops at the state level to get the help and support that the Constitution says we provide public schools. John, you've been paying attention to that. Is there anything else that you would?
I think that pretty much nails it right on the head. I think there's just a lot of things in Topeka right now that the public's going to have to pay close attention to, because things can get slid over to the House or the Senate and can get tied in even with other bills, that all of a sudden some decisions can be made that end up being a surprise for not only public schools, but for patrons across the state.
Next is Senate Bill 368, and this again seems to kind of take a shot at the control that the local people have over how they do things. In the past, if there was an issue, from how I understand it, there was an issue that was going to be put on a local ballot. The school or local government could use funds to promote these issues to let people know about them. So I guess first off, am I right in my explanation of this? And this bill would look at not allowing that use of public funds anymore. Is that right?
That is correct. All you can do is say, we have this election coming up. You can't give the reasons that make it a benefit to the public schools, to the students in that district, to the community, unless that's done outside the school setting with money that has nothing to do. In the past, you could say, we're asking for this bond question because we need a new media center, or we need to add 3 classrooms because our number of students have been increasing, those kind of things. And you would explain why that was beneficial. Now you can't do that with money that comes from the state. You can organize all you want, but when you hear of all the good things going on in our district, you know how busy our teachers are. That is going to require going even beyond your teachers, who can tell the community, well, this is why we need this. You have to have other people involved in getting anything passed and funding getting that passed. And they don't necessarily understand the benefits. Not that they can't, they can learn. It's just a matter of time. In the world that we live in today, time is a resource, and we've got to take good care of that, and we want to be able to explain. And the Secretary of State, Chris Kobach, is the one that is pushing this. It's not even something that came up through the legislative ranks. It came from that entity, and that's the way laws are made. That's okay. It just definitely will make the passing, whether it's a local option budget or whether it is a construction of some sort, will make it much more difficult.
I think one thing to add to what it does, and I don't know if this is the intention of it, but it ends up making it so there's limited information that gets out to the patrons. So if there is a bond issue or something, if you're not publicizing the benefits for it, you may not get the votes needed to move forward in a positive way for children.
And typically, just like advertising, the way to get people to vote is to appeal to what's important to people and
Sure.
appeal to their emotions. So if we're unable to share any of that information, most likely I don't know what the voter percentage is right now or what the average response is for voter registration, but most certainly this bill could impact that.
Voting is great. Being an informed voter is even better. So it's not just putting that vote in, but really knowing what you're voting for. And before we talk about this next bill, I think it's important to mention schools never want to turn away anybody. And they want to help and reach out and make an impact on absolutely every kid possible. Senate Bill 367 essentially would take kids out of the juvenile system that are, the state juvenile system, so they would go from state custody and it would get them back in their local school system. So I guess what I would kind of want to talk about here is, if this bill goes through, what could maybe be some of the added, stresses or concerns that a school might have, trying to take on more an influx of these kids?
I'll start out with one of the biggest impacts is, do we currently have on staff the teachers and the support staff that support the needs of those students that come in that have been in a very much more protected environment? If you're a large district like the Wichitas and Topeka's kind of districts, you have school resource officers that are in the building that are available to help when things maybe need more support than is typical in a school. Small communities like ours don't have those kind of resources. Those of us that have been in education for a long time remember how difficult it was when they started to close institutions that supported students with high physical handicap needs, and we had to look at doing business differently. It's part of why we do a special ed co-op, because we can, in our county, we can provide the proper support for kids so that they are making academic advances by sharing and pooling the resources together. And so those are unknowns because we don't know who would come back to our community necessarily. And then we may be the only person in the area that needs to provide support of that kind. So it leaves some uncertainties again.
Well, and Kip, I think you're absolutely right, because we most certainly want to provide a quality education to all students that walk through our doors, and the key word there was quality. I saw on the news last night, this bill proposes saving $75 million over a span of 5 years by shutting down juvenile detention facilities. And like Dr. Summer said, a lot of the larger districts, they already have school resource officers, but in addition to that, they also have things such as social workers and additional counselors and people with play therapy degrees and degrees that may be necessary to work with students who have limited resources or may have limited resources. So even though this bill proposes saving $75 million over the span of 5 years to our states, it was never, I don't think it's ever been addressed how that may shift the responsibility of these expenses then to each local school district. And if we're already struggling with funding education as it is, when we're shifting the responsibility of this expense to the local schools, it would be extremely challenging. It's not that we would not want these students to come and receive a quality education. It's just, okay, so we're going to receive these students. Now the question is, how do we pay for it?
And Audrey shared exactly what I was going to. The only thing I would add too is that while we want students in, if we have the resources to meet their needs, that's one thing. But if we don't have those resources, then we're talking about how that impacts every other student in the building. And so I think the state has to realize is that if they're going to require some of these things, they have to be able to fund them so that we can be successful with all the students, because we can't do something for a small group at the expense of everybody else.
And public schools, the strength of public schools has been the fact that, as the two principals shared, we take every student in our community. They become a part of our school community, and our students learn how to live with a global group of citizenship, where when you're in a place that restricts those kinds of things, the students don't learn how to get along with everybody. But you have to have the resources, and what both Mr. Payton and Ms. Johnson are saying is, without the proper funding, who gets shortchanged, and how we have an incredible education system in USD 444, and how can we maintain that without having to cut other programs or reduce staff, all those kinds of things that make it more difficult for our students to continue to have that respected education that they get in the school district.
I think this really just boils down to a issue of, it's not do we want to, it's can we, and how can we do it well. And our next topic will be not actually a bill that's out there right now, but the Kansas legislature is reviewing the Alvarez and Marshall efficiency report. And this not only could affect the school, but also how well the school can help support the community or town that it's in. So what does this sort of look at, or how could that affect us here? And I understand there's quite a few different parts to this one, so this might be kind of more of a complex topic.
I'm going to first of all say, and then not take the whole conversation away from the principals who have opinions, but what this entity that came in and was paid $2.6 million to do the study has said that over time they will save about a third of the dollars that they think will be savings in the state through the educational programs. We're already shortchanged in education, and to say that we'll have a savings, there's not a savings now. How can there be a savings in the future?
Right.
Or where does that savings go to? Is that going to go back into schools to take care of programs like we just talked about? It is very much a complicated proposal that they put into place.
I think one of the things that ties in with this, you hear at the state level that they want to bring businesses into Kansas, and they want to continue to get people to move to the rural communities, to grow those rural communities. But when they look at things like efficiencies in certain areas that could affect local businesses, my opinion is that that's going to have the total opposite effect. That if you do something where you're not taking care of your local businesses and that money is going elsewhere, you're going to have small town businesses that close. You're going to have people that leave that area, which is going to make things even more difficult on a school system. So I think as people that live in the rural area especially understand supporting our local businesses and doing things through them, while we may not be able to do everything through them, doing some things, that helps the community stay strong. And some of the things that are listed in the efficiency report are good things, I think, and valid things to look at, but I also think there are things that they're going to have to think about if we do them, if they're going to have the opposite effect in the long run.
There are two sections in particular that could impact school districts, whether it's a small district like ours or a large district. They are saying that we need to look at a state health plan, and putting something like that into place as quickly as they're saying it should go into place is questionable. But whether or not it is a reasonable expense, if the new state health plan is $200 more a month per premium than what a school district pays now, how can a superintendent take a recommendation to the state board, to our local district, that we take part in the state health plan when we're going to pay $200 more per premium? The other thing they're saying is, this group has said that we should not have the cash reserves that we have. We don't get our June payment from the state. We're supposed to close our books on June 30th. We don't get our June payment until the first week in July, around July 7th or 8th. But we're paying bills, and we have to have cash in the bank to cover those bills that we have paid, because we don't get the money from the state. And so if you take away that option of having cash reserves because of how schools have been funded in Kansas over the last 10 years, that's a very scary thing too, because if we're paying MTC for our bills and our check bounces, we're going to question that. We have employees that count on their paycheck going through the bank and being covered so they can pay their bills. It goes back to what you were saying about the community as a whole. We depend upon the schools to be a good, solid entity in the community. And some of the things that they're recommending and the quick turnaround for what they're recommending to happen doesn't necessarily give the time to put into play what needs to be there to be sure it's going to be workable in Kansas.
And this last bill that we'll talk about, or that I singled out maybe, was one that maybe generated the most discussion locally and around the state, and that was House Bill 2504. And that put out there that any district or any county, I guess, that was under 10,000 students, I believe, would be consolidated or made one district. So what exactly would this bill have done? Because I understand that it did not pass, so for the moment, it's not going any further. That's not to say in the future it won't pop back up again, but what would this bill have done so we might know going forward?
Well, they termed it the realignment bill, and essentially, I don't know that they really, I think the intent was to eliminate some expense in the fashion of eliminating superintendent roles and administrative roles. And then, when you think about that, if you think about consolidating a school district as one, and placing that responsibility of, let's say, Rice County, approximately how many students do we have in Rice County? Let's say there's 6,000. And you have one person to oversee all of those students. That's a pretty big responsibility. And then you have to wonder what implications could result from that. Would they receive a quality? Would would they receive a quality education? Because ultimately then it would be up to the superintendent to ensure that they have safe facilities and transportation and food service, and the staff is receiving professional development, and the programs are being implemented with fidelity that are in place, and athletics, supervision of students. I mean, there's just numerous things that it would just be very inefficient to have limited administrators operating a one district school.
I think there were a lot of things in that bill that came up that probably in theory sounded like a good idea to someone, and I think Senator or Representative Bradford was the one who initiated that bill, and I sent some emails to him and heard back some response from him, but I think there were just a lot of things that weren't thought through, and that's why I'm really glad it didn't advance to a vote, because they talked about one of the things that was in there is that if Rice County has 10 administrators throughout the county, once that is combined, you could only have, I think it was 120% of whatever the largest district had. So for our whole county, if Lyons has, if they have 7, we'd maybe be able to add one more administrator throughout the entire county. And then you have to start looking, like at Dr. Summers' position, if she's not here, who takes care of transportation and is in charge of food service and lots of other areas that in a larger district, you have administrators in a district over 10,000 that take care of each of those things. So I just think there were a lot of things that weren't thought through. And I think also there were some things, they said this wasn't closing schools, but what was going to be the long-term effect that if you hit something hard enough that it causes problems, what's the next decision going to have to be down the line? And I think again that's where the public has to stay on top and be aware when these bills come up again, which it possibly could, and to know that how could this affect not just this year. They're saying this bill has gone away, but in future years, how could it affect? And I'm not so sure with this bill too, and maybe I'm being pessimistic, but they said this bill went away. Does that let the public kind of go, oh, they're not going to consolidate schools, so the other bills on bond issues, that's not a big deal. We won't worry about that. Well, each of those little things that they do that take away local control, I think can affect things in the long run. The other thing I might mention, the board aspect from different districts that would have been combined, they never really stated on how, if we were combined into one Rice County school district, what would be our representation on a board over there? Would they do that by size? Would Lyons have 4 representatives and Sterling have 1 and us have 1 and Chase have 1? Some point in time when tough decisions have to be made, the representation might not be there. So
They were extremely proud to say they weren't going to close schools. That was not the intent. But if you think about what Mr. Payton just shared, the point is the quality of multiple districts and schools of choice that our families have now, because we have students from various locations that choose to come here. That was not considered in how this plan was put together if you're from a different county. And we have, Wyndham is 1 mile into McPherson County. And so the implications of those kind of things were not a part of the discussion. So it is really to our benefit that this didn't go any further, but like John said, I think the issue is not dead. I think we have to stay tuned into this and be aware and be ready to share information better than now that we know sort of kinds of things to look at, so that we can be prepared for responses in the future.
And I think with a lot of these bills, there are places that you can go to maybe get a brief summary, but with a lot of these bills, there's so many different layers to them and so many different aspects to really understand what you're voting on. It takes a little bit of your time, and it's going to take more than 30 seconds and a brief glance at your screen, to understand what these bills would fully do. So, because there's just so many different things that these bills talk about. You got to stay in tune.
And when they get to the end of the legislative session, just like what happened last year, there were things that happened in the final hours that were slid into other bills that I don't think even legislators really knew exactly what was in there and that were voted on. So I think that that can definitely create some concern and some problems as we move through the next few months.
And we talked about how these bills, how they affect schools. But if you know how a small town works, if something affects the school, it literally affects everything else. So these bills, maybe somebody's watching this and they think, well, I don't have a kid in school. Maybe this doesn't affect me. I don't have, a big interest or stake in our school system. If you live in a small town, you have a stake in the school system. And Mr. Payton, there was an article, and I just read this, the day before we're filming, so I didn't have a chance to put it in my questions, but you recently wrote an article for the Modern Journal, and it was called What Concerns Me, and I thought it was really well done. Maybe talk about your motivation for why you wanted to write that, what you thought you had to get out, and maybe just briefly what it was about.
Okay. As I mentioned in the article, I've been in education for 25 years, and my parents were involved in education, my grandparents, so the profession is dear to my heart. But I probably over especially the last 2 or 3 years, I have not been concerned to the point that I am about where things are headed right now. And again, not to make it a political statement because that's not what I intended with my article, but there seems to at least be a portion or group of people that are legislators to represent people that for whatever reason it seems or appears there's a push against public education. I am not opposed to homeschooling. I have family that does that. I'm not opposed to private schools, but the thing that concerns me the most is we can't have choice at the expense of public schools, which is sometimes the only choice that some kids have. And so that's what it was about, and I typed that article actually in the middle of the night one evening when I couldn't get to sleep, and I started thinking about the things that concern me, so I just put some of those points out there, and I'm just at a time I would love to be able to, when my boys are in high school and say, man, I'd like to go into teaching and maybe be a coach and maybe someday be an administrator. And I think it's sad when we're in the position we are now and the way things are right now that I couldn't probably in good faith encourage a lot of people say, go into public education right now, make a difference, you can do it. Because it'd be one thing, people who go into public education I don't think do it for the money, but you do it for some satisfaction and you hope you get some appreciation from people, which I think we do locally. But I think overall public education is taking a hit right now, and I don't know that there are enough good reasons to draw good people in. And then my concern comes that, as we move forward in education, that if we're not getting good quality people to come into the profession, and the people going into it don't have the drive and desire, that I have a feeling our public education system with lack of funding and with lack of good people in it is going to start to go downhill. And hopefully it becomes a thing that public education isn't a political topic, that we talk about doing what's best for kids and make decisions that way, which right now I think it's too political right now, and there's a lot of money involved.
It is my hope because of the money involved. It seems that it has become, public education has become the target because we are what we spend the most on in the state. And so I just hope that legislators really reflect and think about, and I hope that we can advocate for them to think about some other things that we can do other than target public education all the time.
The Constitution of Kansas says that the state will fund public schools. It doesn't say they will fund private schools. It doesn't say they will fund homeschoolers. They're responsible for taking care of public education. And all of those places go back to what I said earlier about choices. Families do need to have a choice, but the Constitution says we'll take care of public schools, and that's where we're struggling right now. There is another law out there that they're expanding for families to take their children to private schools as long as they meet free and reduced lunch criteria. But they're saying if they're going to develop a new school funding system, that free and reduced lunch criteria isn't a good at-risk factor. They're speaking out of both sides of their mouth. But with this bill that they're looking at to pay for private schools, a family could make a donation to that scholarship fund, and a particular private school could say, okay, your kid can come tuition free, and then they get a 9% tax credit for the amount of money they put in there. We're looking at financial trouble in Kansas, not just for public schools, but for roads and for healthcare, and the list goes on. And we should be looking at how do we equalize that collection of revenue versus how we find ways to, as I'm sort of putting words in your mouth, John, but to make public school less inviting than what it has been in the past. It's been the great equalizer in our country. We all can tell stories about our families and what public school did for the children in our families. We can't do that if we can't fund the schools properly.
Right.
I don't know how many years the funding has been at the level it has, because you always hear about it being 50% or half of our state spending is on education. And I included in my article, what other area would we want to put half of our money into than education and the future of our kids? So.
Well, I do want to thank all of you for taking the time to sit down and talk about this. I think it's important that we do everything we can to get the information out to people. There's been a lot of great info put out there for people to learn. So thank you again for your time, and I'm sure we'll be checking back in later. As we did mention, we need to keep fresh on these things. So I'm sure we will be in touch later in the school year.
Thank you for the opportunity.